Mr. Clement.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the Court, the mandate represents an unprecedented effort by Congress to compel individuals to enter commerce in order to better regulate commerce. The Commerce Clause gives Congress the power to regulate existing commerce. It does not give Congress the far greater power to compel people to enter commerce, to create commerce essentially in the first place.
Can I go back for a step? Because I don't want to get into a discussion of whether this is a good bill or not. Some people think it's going to save a lot of money. Some people think it won't. So I'm focusing just on the Commerce Clause, not on the Due Process Clause, the Commerce Clause. And I look back into history, and I think if we look back into history, we see sometimes Congress can create commerce out of nothing. That's the National Bank, which was created out of nothing to create other commerce out of nothing. I look back into history, and I see it seems pretty clear that if there are substantial effects on interstate commerce, Congress can act.
Well, Justice Breyer, let me start at the beginning of your question with McCulloch. McCulloch was not a commerce power case.
It was both?
It was not — no, the bank was not justified and the corporation was not justified as an exercise of the commerce power. So that is not a case that says that it's okay to conjure up the bank as an exercise of the commerce power. And what, of course, the Court didn't say, and I think the Court would have had a very different reaction to, is, we're not just going to have the bank, because that would be necessary and proper. We're going to force the citizenry to put all their money in the bank, because if we do that, then we know the Bank of the United States will be secure. I think the framers would have identified the difference between those two scenarios, and I don't think that the great Chief Justice would have said that forcing people to put their deposits in the Bank of the United States was necessary and proper. Now, if you look through all the cases you mentioned, I do not think you will find a case like this. And I think it's telling that you won't. I mean, the regulation of the wheat market in Wickard against Filburn, all this effort to address the supply side and what producers could do, what Congress was trying to do was support the price of wheat. It would have been much more efficient to just make everybody in America buy 10 loaves of bread. That would have had a much more direct effect on the price of wheat in the prevailing market. But we didn't do that. We didn't say, when we had problems in the automobile industry, that we're not just going to give you incentives, not just cash for clunkers. We're going to actually have everybody over $100,000 has to buy a new car.
Well, Mr. Clement, the key to the government's argument to the contrary is that everybody is in this market. It's all right to regulate Wickard against Filburn because that's a particular market in which the farmer had been participating. Everybody is in this market, so that makes it very different than the market for cars or the other hypotheticals that you came up with. And all they're regulating is how you pay for it.
Well, with respect, Mr. Chief Justice, I suppose the first thing you have to say is what market are we talking about? Because the government, this statute undeniably operates in the health care insurance market. And the government can't say that everybody's in that market. The whole problem is that everybody's not in that market, and they want to make everybody get into that.
Well, doesn't that seem a little bit, Mr. Clement, cutting the baloney thin? I mean, health insurance exists only for the purpose of financing health care. The two are inextricably interlinked. We don't get insurance so that we can stare at our insurance certificate. We get it so that we can go and access health care.
Mr. Carvin?
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. May it please the Court. In other words, Congress does not have the power to promote commerce. Congress has the power to regulate commerce. And if the power exceeds their permissible regulatory authority, then the law is invalid.
Well, surely regulation includes the power to promote. Since the New Deal, we've said there's regulation in there's a market in agricultural products. Congress has the power to subsidize, to limit production, all sorts of things.
Absolutely, Chief Justice, and that's the distinction I'm trying to draw. When they're acting within their enumerated power, then obviously they're promoting commerce. But the Solicitor General wants to turn it into a different power. He wants to say we have the power to promote commerce, to regulate anything to promote commerce. And if they have the power to promote commerce, then they have the power to regulate everything, right?
I don't think you're addressing their main point, which is that they're not creating commerce in health care. It's already there. And we're all going to need some kind of health care, or most of us will, at some point.
I'd like to address that in two ways, if I could, Mr. Chief Justice. In the first place, they keep playing mix and match with the statistics. They say 95% of us are in the health care market, okay? But that's not the relevant statistic, even as the government frames the issue. No one in Congress or the Solicitor General is arguing that going to the doctor and fully paying him creates a problem. The problem is uncompensated care. And they say the uncompensated care arises if you have some kind of catastrophe, hit by a bus, have some prolonged illness. Well, what is the percentage of the uninsured that have those sorts of catastrophes? We know it's got to be a relatively small fraction. So in other words,
but we don't know who they are.
We don't. No, and we don't know in advance, but that doesn't change the basic principle that you are nonetheless forcing people for paternalistic reasons to go into the insurance market to insure against risks that they have made the voluntary decision that they have decided not to.
It just seems very strange to me that there's no question we can have a Social Security system besides all the people who say, I'm being forced to pay for something I don't want. And this, which seems to me to try to get care for the ones who need it by having everyone in the pool, but is also trying to preserve a role for the private sector, for the private insurers. There's something very odd about that the government can take over the whole thing and we all say, oh, yeah, that's fine. But if the government wants to preserve private insurers, can't do that.
Well, I don't think the test of a law's constitutionality is whether it more adheres to the libertarian principles of the Cato Institute or the statist principles of someone else. I think the test of a law is constitutionally is not those policy questions. It's whether or not the law is regulating things that negatively affect commerce or don't. And since obviously the failure to purchase an item doesn't create the kind of effects on supply and demand that the market participants in Wickard and Raich did, and doesn't in any way interfere with regulation of the insurance companies, I don't think it can pass the basic...
I thought that Wickard was, you must buy. We're not going to let you use the homegrown wheat. You have to go out in the market and buy that wheat that you don't want.
Oh, but let's be careful about what they were regulating in Wickard, Justice Ginsburg. What they were regulating was the supply of wheat. It didn't in any way imply that they could require every American to go out and buy wheat. And yes, one of the consequences of regulating local market participants is it'll affect the supply and the demand for the product. That's why you can regulate them, because those local market participants have the same effect on the interstate market that a black market has on a legal market. Under your theory, you could regulate anybody if they've got a statistical connection to a problem. You could say, since we could regulate people who enter into the mortgage market and impose mortgage insurance on them, we can simply impose the requirement to buy private mortgage insurance on everybody before they've entered the market, because we're doing it in this prophylactic way before it develops. And
No, that's not. I don't think that's fair, because not everybody is going to enter the mortgage market. Well, the government's position is that almost everybody is going to enter the healthcare market.
It is clear that the failure to buy health insurance doesn't affect anyone. Defaulting on your payments to your health care provider does. Congress chose, for whatever reason, not to regulate the harmful activity of defaulting on your health care provider. They used the 20% or whoever among the uninsured as a leverage to regulate the 100% of the uninsured.
I agree that that's what's happening here.
Okay.
And the government tells us that's because the insurance market is unique, and in the next case it'll say the next market is unique. But I think it is true that if most questions in life are matters of degree, in the insurance and health care world, both markets, stipulate two markets, the young person who's uninsured is uniquely, proximately very close to affecting the rates of insurance and the cost of providing medical care in a way that is not true in other industries. That's my concern in the case.
And I may be misunderstanding you, Justice Kennedy. I hope I'm not. Sure, it would be perfectly fine if they allowed you do actuarial risk for young people on the basis of their risk for disease, just like you judge flood insurance on the homeowner's risk of flood. One of the issues here is not only that they're compelling us to enter into the marketplace, they're prohibiting us from buying the only economically sensible product that we would want, catastrophic insurance.